Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. I bet you won't guess what we're going to talk about now. I'm going to talk about moral realism again. Why? Because I love the subject of moral realism. And first, I'll tell you why I love it. And then I will get into what the topic is that I will address, which is basically moral realism versus moral relativism and the third world. Since I am a Maoist third worldist, in addition to being a critical realist, in addition to being an intersectional Marxist, in addition to being, I don't know, tons of other things to do, I suppose, I like talking about moral realism. It's one of my favorite topics. There's nothing really more that I like talking about more than moral realism. Maybe some as much, but not more. So I used to be a moral relativist. I feel like I'm at a 12-step meeting, and and I've never been into the 12-step movement. It's never appealed to me. Plus, I don't have any addictions. I'm not an addicted person. So I would really have no reason to be to be in a 12-step meeting. But in principle, I don't really care much for it. And that's really off topic. And I probably should not have even mentioned that because I don't want to upset any of you who might be 12-steppers. I have nothing against 12-steppers in principle. Okay. I was a moral relativist for a number of years. In fact, one of the things which I found difficult, difficult to accept in critical realism was moral realism. Now, are there some critical realists who reject moral realism? Yes, there are some. There are some critical realists who do reject moral realism. I don't know what the percentage is, but I know there are some. Now, was Roy Bhaskar, the founder of critical realism, a moral realist? Yes. In fact, he remained a moral realist throughout the history, the various turns, as he called them, or stages of critical realism. Turns is one of those academic terms that if you're not an academic, you probably have never heard used, but it basically means a stage. I saw everything as being relative. In retrospect, it makes no sense to me. How could I be a morally relativist Marxist? What that would mean is that I would have to say that, well, maybe communism is good for some countries, but capitalism is good for others. Right? I mean, that would be the logical conclusion to being a morally relativist Marxist communist. Did I ever think about it in that way? Not really. So my thoughts about moral relativism were more focused on the ideas of Michel Foucault. And I liked Michel Foucault's discussion of language. And that's basically what he was. Michel Foucault was a philosopher and a linguist. And Michel Foucault used to be a Marxist. He gave up Marxism and became one of the founders of what became known as post-structuralism. Michel Foucault, along with this other individual, also a founder of post-structuralism, Jacques Derrida, are considered as being the twin founders of post-structuralism. Both of them hated the term post-structuralism. Why? I don't know. But regardless, the term stuck. You know, what are you going to do? Things happen. And so both of them are known as post-structuralists, even though they probably would not be very happy about that. And again, I don't know why, but my assumption is they'd be upset. They probably would write an article on it, maybe even together, objecting to it, maybe coming up with some alternate term. I have no idea what that term would be. But in any event, I liked the idea of thinking about communism and capitalism as languages. I thought that if we saw capitalism, for example, as a language, that basically a revolution would be a linguistic revolution in part. It would mean that we could have a revolution without violence and basically just change the way in which sentences are ordered, which is another way of saying syntax, and that would be the revolution. Now, does that make any sense to me anymore? No, but it did make sense to me at one time, maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. So it wasn't that long ago that I was a post-structuralist. And as a result, a moral relativist. Because if you are a post-structuralist, you are inevitably going to be a moral relativist. You can't escape it. Because relativism is a part of language. Words are, by their nature, relative. We change the way we speak in different situations. So, how we use a word, what we mean by a word in one situation may be different from how we use a word and what we mean by a word in a different situation, right? Seems somewhat logical to me. Well, it's not logical to me anymore, but the explanation, I think, was relatively logical, I hope. So reducing revolution to language, these days, I think that's silly. More than silly, I think it's dangerous because it wouldn't work. You can't have a revolution in language. Revolutions require organization. Revolutions ultimately, I think, will require the organization in the third world because the first world is not ready for revolutions. There is, I'm not going to say no, but I will say insufficient revolutionary or dialectical potential in the first world. Certainly not no revolutionary or dialectical potential. That would be an exaggeration. I mean, I have seen situations where I have observed what at least I interpreted as an instance of dialectical or revolutionary potential in a particular act. But was it enough to actually have a revolution? Well, I think the biggest evidence of why the answer is no is the fact that we haven't had one. And we've had many opportunities. The one that comes to my mind is 9/11. I genuinely thought, or hoped, I guess is more accurate than thought, that there would be or could be a revolution after 9/11 in the US. Why? Well, because there was this massive crisis. Everyone was upset. We were angry at Osama bin Laden. Ultimately, we were angry at Iraq, which, as we all know, had nothing to do with it anyway. But obviously, that did not dissuade politicians from using Iraq anyway as an excuse to go to them to go to war against them, there is never, never a lack of reasons to start a war. You can always find reasons to start a war. That is never, ever something which can be avoided if you don't want to avoid it. In other words, if you want to have a war, you can find reasons to have a war, and there are plenty of them. Mostly making money for oil companies, mostly making money for large multinational corporations of all different sorts. And wars are very, very profitable enterprises. So it's not surprising that the US, which has a lot of money in its defense budget, more than any other country in the world, would always be looking to start a war. Okay, that's a bit of a off-topic discussion. Going back to the idea of relativism. Yeah, I was a relativist. I was a moral relativist. I felt that what might be moral in one situation might be immoral in another. That there was no such thing as an absolute, maybe absolute is the wrong word, but an unerring standard of morality. That what was moral depended on the situation, which is the reason why there's a very close cousin of moral relativism called situation ethics. They're not precisely the same, but they're close enough to the point where getting into a discussion of the distinction between them would be so mind-exploding that there's no point in doing it, so I won't do it. But there is actually a distinction between those two concepts, moral relativism and situation ethics. They sound the same, but they're not precisely the same. Okay. Now, eventually, I realized the error of my ways. I realized that moral relativism and situation ethics made no sense. And so I gave them up, and I began to agree with Roy Bhaskar. In fact, I agree with Roy Bhaskar on almost everything. There are a couple of things here and there that I don't, but they are relatively minor points. And in my view, what I have done is I have actually corrected Roy Bhaskar's errors. And some people, believe it or not, agree with me. Wouldn't you know it? Roy Bhaskar, toward the end of his life, appeared to a lot of critical realists, including me, to be drifting toward a kind of ontological idealism. And that was primarily in the way he understood how the world was constituted. So I figured out a way around it. And that was appreciated by a lot of people. I'll leave it at that, because that's not really the topic for today, or the topic for the moment anyway. So once I accepted moral realism, I had to abandon all the assumptions, all the post-Marxist, now there's a big word there, post-Marxist. Post-Marxist is a combination of post-structuralist and Marxist. So they are both post-structuralists and they are Marxists, which is confusing since Foucault was originally a Marxist, but then he left Marxism and began to start post-structuralism. But these people believe that those two things can be reconciled. Now, is post-Marxism really popular anymore? No. It's popular with some people, but it's not extremely popular. Its heyday really was in the 80s and 90s. Since that time, it has lost the energy that it seemed to have back during that time. So, as a moral realist, what do I need to do? I look at the third world and I look at the inequities in the third world. I look at the lack of power, the lack um, of economic might, the lack of political might, the lack of military might, which exists in the third world. And I see how the third world has been constantly twisted by the first world to the advantage of the first world. That's happening right now. It's happening with Israel and Gaza. So there you have it. I could end the podcast right now, but I won't. I will keep on going to make my points a bit more succinctly, or a bit more closely, or a bit more devoutly, whatever. I will continue for a bit. As a moral realist, I began to see that the issues which existed in the third world were not relative, they were real. And really, that realization for me was liberating. Because believing that the problems in the third world are relative can lead one to be apathetic. Because if they're relative, they can simply be changed by restructuring one's language. But that's not true. It has nothing to do with language. It has to do with oppression and domination by the first world. And so the third world is in the position that it is right now without an ability to enforce its own moral goals on the world because of the power of the first world. Unfortunately, although there is a moral reality, most people don't seem to believe that. Or perhaps out of convenience, they are unwilling to discuss it. And so the result is that whether they believe or don't believe in the existence of a moral reality, they act as if there is not one. Or that the moral reality is the reality that they believe in, the reality which benefits them. I remember back when I was still working, before my unemployment, well, my retirement, technically, not unemployment, retirement. Although I am unemployed, I guess that's true, but not because I was fired, but because I'm literally retired. When I was still teaching classes, I had this one student in my class, and I was making the point of a standard for what is morally real, a standard for what is moral. And I was exploring what that standard was. And I was trying to convey the idea that if we want to understand the standard for morality, we have to explore the nature of the universe and the nature of what it means to be human, like we discussed in previous podcasts: co-presence and demi-reality. Co-presence as the higher nature, demi-reality as the lower nature. That's the way we can understand what is morally real, literally by understanding the universe, and even more literally by understanding ourselves, our own makeup, and what we have chosen to do. Do we choose rather, not choose, do we choose to attach ourselves to demi-reality, or do we choose to attach ourselves to co-presence? The fact is that people in the first world have by and large chosen to attach themselves to demi-reality. That is the objective reality of this world. It is a world of demi-reality. It is a world of Maya, Sanskrit for illusion. It is a world of disunity. It is a world of splitting. All of those things apply to the world in which we are now living. We are not living in a world of unity. We are not living in a world of co-presence, which is the opposite of demi-reality. We are living in a world which is literally the absence of co-presence. And in order to achieve co-presence, demi-reality would need to be absented. And then ultimately, we might have something like emancipation, human emancipation. But there is no emancipation in the third world. And the third world is primarily what I care about. And so when I am applying Roy Bhaskars's critical realism, which is a methodology in my view. Now, Roy called it a meta theory, but I think more accurately, it should be referred to as a methodology. So when I'm applying the methodology of critical realism to the world today, primarily, I am interested in the third world. Why? Because I believe that the third world is ultimately the only hope that the world has for attaining communism. And critical realism is a method or a methodology for achieving communism. That's what critical realism is. That's especially what the philosophy of meta-reality is, which is simply an expansion of the critical realism to focus on issues of more of a spiritual nature, I suppose you could call them. Well, that's what Roy called them. So I guess by my calling them that, I'm not adding anything to it that Roy didn't already add. So we are living in a world that is really void or empty of any form of co-presence, of any form of unity. And we can see that in the crisis between Israel and Gaza. And so, as a Maoist third worldist, my interest primarily is on answering the question, how can I, as an individual, act to the benefit of the third world? Now, I would say that what I can do is limited. I regret deeply, I must say, to be honest with you, that I do not live in the third world. In some ways, I feel that way. Not in all ways. I'll explain that, but in some ways I do. Because if I lived in the third world, I could be a first-hand witness to what's going on and perhaps attempt the process of reparation, or at least cooperate with others in the process of reparation. So that's my regret, not living in the third world. My reason for having some reservations over that is because I was born in New York City, in the first world, obviously. And being born in the first world has accorded me extraordinarily good educational opportunities to the point where I was able to get a Ph.D. in sociology and to become a tenured college professor and a dean at one point. Would I have been able to achieve those things if I were born in the third world? Maybe. But I think the chances of that are considerably more remote. So being a native of the first world, being born in a land of unjustified affluence, literally unjustified affluence, has enabled me to do things which I don't think I would have been able to do had I been born in the third world. So in that sense, I'm grateful that I was born and raised in the first world, because it has given me tools that I might not have if I were born and raised in the third world. I can engage in conscientization on the internet. There are a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people in the third world who have no access to the internet. The term used for that is the digital divide. There is a digital divide in the world. Now, on a smaller scale, that digital divide even exists in the first world. You know, people who can afford the internet, people who really can't in the first world, but that's a much smaller problem. The major problem is the fact that there are a lot of people in a lot of countries around the world who cannot afford the cost of internet access. And maybe even if they could afford it, there might not be any internet available to them. Any kind of internet, whether satellite, whether cable, whether telephone, any kind. So I recognize that those kinds of disadvantages exist for many people who live in the third world. And so if I were born there, I too might have those disadvantages. And so I think from that perspective, I'm grateful that as a first worlder, you notice I said first worlder, not first worldist, because I'm not a first worldist, but as a first worlder, I have the ability to access the internet and to engage in conscientization on the internet and potentially reach those people who are in the third world, who are lucky, who are fortunate enough to have internet access, and to share the knowledge that I have acquired in getting my PhD in sociology, and in my research, and my writing, and in my teaching, all of which has added to the base of my knowledge. So I have kind of mixed feelings about that subject. But basically, point I wanted to make. The third world is much more important than the first world right now. Much more important. In fact, I would say that the first world is getting to the point of utter uselessness. We are destroying ourselves. And in some ways, we are taking the first world with us, or at least parts of the third world, like Gaza, for example. But there are some parts of the third world which I hope, I don't know, will survive the ultimate catastrophe that we are in right now and be able to redeem itself, if that's the right word. Maybe redeem is the wrong word, but be able to recover, maybe is a better word, from the trauma of first worldism, which is so predominant in the world today, and become genuine third worlders. So people being in the third world, by definition, they live in the third world, but they're not necessarily third worldists. In fact, many of them may share the ideology of the first world. And so what I hope is that condition, which I think is currently so widespread in the world today, will eventually be defeated. And so Maoism, third worldism, will become the dominant point of view in both the third world, and if there is any remnant, and I don't know if there will be, but if there is any remnant of the first world in the first world as well. And then perhaps the third world might be able to embark through critical realism, which again is a methodology for achieving communism, may be able to embark on a journey, on an odyssey toward a communist society, a society much better than the current capitalist world system that we now live under. For the time being, this is Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.